by another in response. It is not acceptable and would cause the U.S. and Mexico inflation and job losses.
Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, threatening to raise tariffs on American goods in response to President-elect Trump's vow to raise tariffs on Mexican goods, unless the country does more to stop illegal immigration and drug trafficking.
The weapons are not produced by us. These synthetic drugs are not consumed by us.
Mexico and Canada say they're open to dialogue with the president-elect.
We talked about some of the challenges that we can work on together. It was a good call.
Trump says he'll impose a 25% tariff on all their products unless they secure their borders. U.S. Border Patrol on the Canadian border in Vermont, New York, and New Hampshire say it's apprehended more than 19,000 people from 97 different countries since October 2023, more than its last 17 fiscal years combined. The Canadian government said Monday border security is its highest priority. Trump's tariff plan does not exempt crude oil. Canada warning Americans, quote, Canada is essential to U.S. domestic energy supply, and last year 60% of U.S. crude oil imports originated in Canada. And it's not just oil. Experts say tariffs could raise prices on cars, computers, agriculture, from avocados to strawberries, and liquor like tequila and beer. Others say not so fast.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty interesting, pretty complex, involving U.S. Mexico relations, and specifically, President-elect Trump's approach to immigration,
Right?
and drugs, and all this kind of stuff. So you sent us a fascinating article from Fox News,
Yeah.
and we're going to be unpacking that together. One thing that really jumped out at me was that Trump is threatening tariffs again. But this time, it's not just Mexico. There's a China angle, too. It's a real international tangle.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. And the timing couldn't be more interesting with the new Mexican president, right?
Exactly. So to kind of set the scene, the Fox News article lays out how Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on goods from both Mexico and Canada if they don't step up efforts to curb illegal immigration and drug trafficking.
Right.
And he's specifically calling out fentanyl coming from China through Mexico, which adds a whole nother layer to this whole thing. Well, it's interesting because Trump using tariffs as a negotiating tactic isn't new, right? We saw that with the trade war with China during his first term. But this situation has a different feel to it. We have a new Mexican administration. Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo is the new president, and the fentanyl crisis is adding this sense of urgency that wasn't there before.
Yeah. It's like everyone's trying to figure out their next move on like this constantly shifting chessboard.
Absolutely.
The article mentioned that Mexico was initially ready to retaliate with tariffs of their own. But then Trump announced he had a wonderful conversation with President Sheinbaum. He even claims that she agreed to stop migration through Mexico.
Wow.
Effectively closing the U.S. southern border.
Well, that's where it gets a little bit murky, because while Trump's statement paints a picture of complete agreement, President Sheinbaum's official statement, as reported by Reuters, is much more cautious. It really emphasizes security collaboration rather than, a complete shutdown.
Right.
So it kind of raises the question, what did they actually agree to, and how much of this is just political posturing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it makes me think about the potential impact on, just everyday life.
Sure.
Are we talking about major shifts in border policy, changes in trade, maybe even price hikes on certain goods?
I mean, those are all possibilities. We know the U.S. relies heavily on both Mexico and China economically. So any kind of disruption in that trade could have ripple effects throughout the entire supply chain, potentially impacting what you see on store shelves and how much you pay for things.
It's amazing how connected everything is.
It is.
Speaking of China, let's not forget that Trump also threatened them with an additional 10% tariff on goods, specifically targeting chemicals used to make fentanyl.
Okay.
So he's essentially saying China is partly to blame for the fentanyl crisis because they're supplying some of these ingredients.
It's a bold move. And it's interesting to see how China's pushing back. The article quotes an editorial from the China Daily, which is essentially the voice of the Chinese government. And they're calling Trump's reasoning far-fetched.
Right.
So they're clearly not going to accept that narrative without a fight.
It really highlights how this issue extends far beyond the U.S. and Mexico.
Absolutely.
It's a global problem with this complex web of players and motivations.
Exactly. And at the center of it all is the fentanyl crisis itself.
Right.
This drug is incredibly potent and dangerous. Just a tiny amount can be fatal. It's already caused a surge in overdoses and deaths across America.
Yeah.
And its impact is felt in communities nationwide.
It's a tragic situation, and the article mentions that Trump is planning a massive fentanyl awareness campaign to try and combat it.
Okay.
You know, he's hoping to educate people about the dangers of this drug. But I wonder if that's enough.
That's the key question. While raising awareness about the dangers of fentanyl is certainly important, we have to think about if it's actually addressing the root causes of this crisis.
Right.
You know, this isn't just a matter of people making bad choices. There are deeper underlying issues like poverty, trauma, lack of access to health care. All these things contribute to the demand for these drugs.
We were just talking about how complex this fentanyl crisis really is and how it's not just about like individual choices, you know?
Right.
It seems like there's this whole web of like social and economic factors at play that contribute to like the demand for these really dangerous drugs.
Yeah, you can't just tell people don't do drugs and expect the problem to go away.
Right.
There are often deeper reasons why someone might turn to substances like fentanyl. And those reasons need to be addressed if we want to actually make a difference.
It makes you think about like the bigger picture here, you know? We got this like international standoff brewing, potential economic impacts looming, and a public health crisis, you know, unfolding, all interconnected in ways that are just hard to fully grasp.
Absolutely.
It can feel overwhelming.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, but I think it's helpful to remember that even amidst all this complexity, there are some like glimmers of hope.
Okay.
You know, despite all the tough talk and posturing,
Right.
the fact that President Trump and President Sheinbaum are at least communicating is a positive sign.
Yeah, it seems like they both have a vested interest in finding some common ground, especially when it comes to like issues like border security and drug trafficking.
For sure.
Neither country wants to see uncontrolled migration or a flood of fentanyl crossing their borders.
Exactly. And I remember that more cautious statement from President Sheinbaum where she talked about security collaboration. That could be a sign that they're actually working on a joint plan.
Right.
To tackle these issues, even if the public pronouncements make it sound like they're at odds.
So maybe behind the scenes, they're exploring things like, you know, increased intelligence sharing, joint operations, targeting drug cartels.
Possibly.
Or even some kind of coordinated border patrol effort.
Those are all possibilities. Of course, the devil's in the details.
Right.
And any agreement would need to address the concerns of both countries. But the potential for collaboration is there.
Right.
And that's something to keep in mind as we're trying to make sense of this whole evolving situation.
That makes me think about China's role in all of this. They seem pretty resistant to Trump's accusations and his threat of tariffs.
Right.
How do they fit into this idea of cooperation?
That's where things get even trickier. China is a global superpower with its own interests.
Right.
And those interests don't always align with those of the U.S. or Mexico.
Yeah.
But even though they're pushing back against Trump's narrative,
right,
China also has a vested interest in stability.
Okay.
They don't want to be seen as a rogue state contributing to the fentanyl crisis.
So maybe there's a way to engage them in like a constructive dialogue, even if it's going to be a challenge.
Exactly. It would require, you know, a very delicate diplomatic dance.
Right.
Finding areas of common concern and working toward shared solutions. This could involve things like, you know, cracking down on the production and export of fentanyl precursors, the chemicals used to make fentanyl,
right,
or increased cooperation on intelligence and law enforcement. It's a long shot, but not impossible.
Okay. So we've got this potential roadmap for cooperation. The U.S. and Mexico working together on border security and drug interdiction.
Right.
With the possibility of bringing China into the fold through some, you know, carefully orchestrated diplomacy.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic. There are going to be some major obstacles along the way.
Absolutely. We're talking about deeply ingrained issues here. Poverty, lack of opportunity in Mexico and Central America that's driving migration.
Yeah.
The power and influence of drug cartels.
Right.
The complexities of international trade and diplomacy. These aren't problems that are just going to be solved overnight with a handshake and a photo op.
And let's not forget the political realities in each country. Any agreement's going to face scrutiny and opposition from various groups. And there's always that risk that political maneuvering could derail even the best laid plans.
Yeah, you're right. We have to be realistic about the challenges. But even with all the uncertainty and the potential for conflict, I think it's important to acknowledge that the very nature of the fentanyl crisis, its devastating impact on all three countries, could actually be a catalyst for a more unified response.
You mean like the shared threat might force them to work together in a way they haven't before?
That's a possibility. Shared threats can sometimes lead to unlikely alliances. Think about it. None of these countries benefit from a situation where fentanyl is ravaging communities and claiming lives. It's a problem that demands a coordinated response. And that might create a unique opportunity for cooperation.
That's a slightly more optimistic outlook than I was expecting, but I appreciate you bringing that perspective to the table.
Sure.
It's a good reminder that even in the midst of complex and challenging situations, there's always potential for positive change.
Of course, optimism needs to be tempered with a healthy dose of skepticism. We can't just assume that cooperation will magically solve everything. We need to carefully analyze the situation, consider the motivations of all the players involved, and be prepared for setbacks along the way.
That's sound advice. So we've talked about, potential paths toward cooperation, but we also have to acknowledge the very real human cost of this situation.
Of course.
The fentanyl crisis isn't just about statistics and policy debates. It's about people's lives being shattered by addiction.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this crisis doesn't discriminate. It affects people from all walks of life. And its impact ripples through families and communities.
And as we discussed earlier, Trump's response includes this, big fentanyl awareness campaign. But I'm still grappling with whether that's enough. I mean, it's great to raise awareness, but how do we address those deeper societal issues that contribute to the problem in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Raising awareness is a good first step. But it can't be the only step. If we really want to tackle this crisis, we need to address those root causes: poverty, lack of access to mental health care, and the despair that often drives people to seek escape through substances.
So we're talking about like a much broader approach that goes beyond just saying, don't do drugs.
Absolutely.
It seems like we need to invest in solutions that address those underlying issues.
Exactly. This means investing in treatment and prevention programs, addressing economic inequality, providing better access to mental health services, and creating communities where people feel supported and have hope for the future. It's a complex and multifaceted challenge. But it's one we can't afford to ignore.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the political drama and the international back and forth. But we have to remember that at the heart of this issue are real people whose lives are being impacted in profound ways.
And those impacts extend far beyond just the immediate victims of the fentanyl crisis. We've already touched on the potential economic fallout from tariffs. But there are other ripple effects to consider as well.
Like what else should our listener be thinking about as they try to make sense of this whole situation? So we were talking about all these ripple effects, right? Beyond fentanyl, beyond just the economics.
Well, we haven't really talked too much about the potential impact on immigration and border communities. Any significant changes in border policy or enforcement could create a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for folks who live in those areas or have loved ones, who are immigrants.
I can see how that would be a major concern. The article mentioned, increased security measures, stricter enforcement as possibilities. What kind of impact could that have on people's lives?
I mean, just imagine living in a border town where tensions are already high. Increased security measures could mean, more checkpoints, more patrols, greater military presence. This could create a real climate of fear and distrust. Make people feel like they're living in some kind of militarized zone.
That sounds intense. And what about the impact on families? I know there's been a lot of debate about asylum policies, the separation of families at the border.
That's a critical issue. Stricter enforcement could make it even harder for people to seek asylum. Potentially leading to more families being separated or detained.
Oh, gosh.
And even if they're not physically separated, the fear of deportation or being caught in a raid can have a devastating psychological impact.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about like the human side of these policy decisions, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just about numbers and statistics. It's about real people's lives being turned upside down.
Exactly. And the impact extends, beyond individuals and families.
Right.
Think about the economic consequences for border communities.
Okay.
A lot of these towns rely on cross-border trade and tourism.
Right.
So if people are afraid to cross the border,
Yeah.
or businesses are disrupted by these increased security measures,
Right.
it could have a devastating impact on the local economy.
So it's this ripple effect that goes way beyond just the immediate issue of immigration.
Exactly.
It touches on everything from personal safety and family unity to economic stability and community well-being.
It's all interconnected, and I think it's important for our listener to really understand these broader implications as they're following this story. It's not just about political maneuvering, it's about real-world consequences for people's lives.
It's definitely a lot to process. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've explored the potential for cooperation, the potential for conflict between the U.S., Mexico, and China. We unpacked the complexities of the fentanyl crisis. We've examined the potential ripple effects on the economy, immigration, border communities. It's a lot.
It's a complex and constantly evolving situation.
Right.
But I hope our listeners feel a little more informed and equipped to kind of navigate these choppy waters.
Me too. And as always, we encourage you to stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed. Don't just rely on one source for one perspective. Seek out diverse viewpoints, dig deeper into the issues, and form your own conclusions.
That's the best way to be an informed and engaged citizen in a world where information is constantly bombarding us from all directions.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep diving.